All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Lodato, Dean of the Newhouse School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Deanne, Gebell, Gitner Storytelling Symposium. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. Thank you for being here tonight. This symposium is made possible by the Deanne Gebell Gitner Storytelling Fund, established in honor of Associate Professor Seth Gitner's late mother. This generous legacy gift provides resources for Newhouse students to learn from leading experts about the importance of storytelling in public communications. The symposium has quickly become one of our marquee programs here at Newhouse, and this year, especially, that is saying a lot, as we also have celebrated a significant milestone this year. This is, of course, the 60th anniversary of the Newhouse School. Thanks to the generosity and vision of the Newhouse family, this school has developed an incredible legacy of excellence in all types of communications. But make no mistake, as it was in August 1964 when President Johnson cut the ribbon on our school, at our core, and what will never change, is our commitment to journalism. We pledge to continue to champion the critical importance of fact-based journalism in our democracy, a promise exemplified through the establishment of the Syracuse University Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship with our friends at the Maxwell School. Emblematic of this steadfast commitment to journalism is the invitation to our guest tonight. We are excited to host a journalist whose career exemplifies the essence of excellence through storytelling, journalism, and ethical reporting. Marty Baron served as executive editor of the Washington Post from 2013 to 2021. During his tenure, the Post was recognized for its groundbreaking reporting and commitment to truth and transparency. Before the Post, Baron spent 11 years as editor of the Boston Globe. His tenure there included the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for the Globe's coverage of the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal, a story later depicted in the Academy Award-winning film Spotlight. His career also included top editorial positions at the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Miami Herald. In total, newsrooms led by Marty Baron have won a remarkable 17 Pulitzer Prizes, and it's an honor to have him with us this evening. But before we begin, I'd like to welcome Seth Gitner, Associate Professor of Magazine News and Digital Journalism and Visual Communications, to talk about the importance of this Gitner Storytelling Fund and the Symposium Speaker Series. So please welcome Seth Gitner.
Thank you, Dean Lodato. I'm Seth Gitner, and I teach both journalism and photojournalism. And I've been fortunate to follow my mother's footsteps to become a journalist. My mom worked as a reporter for the local newspaper where I grew up in New Jersey. She grew up in Lyons, New York, just a half hour or so east of here. She was in the Lyons High School class of 1962, along with famed former SU basketball coach Jim Boeheim. Her father, who fled Poland during World War I and came here through Ellis Island, was a scrap metal dealer in upstate New York. They were the only Jewish family in town. She was the valedictorian of her class and later met my father while they both were in graduate school in Rochester, New York. After a stint teaching English, my mom's passion for writing led her to journalism, where she wrote for a local newspaper in Millburn, New Jersey. For my bar mitzvah, my parents gave me a camera, and from that moment on, all I wanted to do was be a photojournalist. In high school, I'd do my homework while listening to a police scanner. Whenever I heard tones signaling a car wreck, I convinced my mom to take me to the accident. It's funny to look back on those times, me in the passenger seat of her BMW, camera in hand, off to document the scene before heading home to finish my homework. My dad worked in the airline industry and served on many boards, including as a trustee at his alma mater, Boston University. It was there that he learned the importance of supporting higher education. Today, there are Gitner Lectures, awards, and scholarships at several universities, including Boston University, Cornell, RIT, which is my alma mater, and now here at Syracuse University, a place that truly feels special to me. After my mom passed in 2020, I knew my dad wanted to honor her at a university. And I urged him and my brother to do something at the Newhouse School because I knew this place would do it right. Dad, you already know how proud I am of you. It's not often you get to say that in front of a room full of people, but today I get to do just that. As a father myself, I understand how important it is to make sure everyone feels valued and appreciated, whether it's father to child or child to father. Tonight we're here for the second symposium named for my mother, Deanne Gebell Gitner. Tonight we welcome Marty Baron to Newhouse. I want to thank Marty for accepting the invitation to be a part of this special event. Thank you, Dean Lodato, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight. This event means a great deal to me and my family, and I know my mother would be deeply honored by your presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth, for those remarks. We're excited to be here tonight. Quickly, we have a lot of folks standing up at the back. If you, by chance, have an open seat next to you, could you raise your hand? I see a few seats, especially, there we go. If we come on down, and on the left as you're coming down the stairs, there should be enough seats for everyone. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and move forward. I want to turn tonight's conversation with Marty Baron, which will be moderated by Aileen Gallagher, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a professor in magazine news and digital journalism. Please join me in giving Aileen and Marty a round of applause. Thanks, guys.
I haven't seen the Herg this packed in a long time, so
yeah,
this is really exciting.
Yeah.
We'll start with some current events, and then we'll move into some business, and then a little philosophy. We'll cover everything. So let's start with the election. That's the current events part. And so you've covered a lot of elections, overseen coverage of lots of elections. Some more contentious than others. You oversaw the Florida recount of 2000. And there was a lot of kind of lessons learned, a lot of the press re-examining how it did its coverage after 2016. So do you see right now any of those lessons learned being applied by the press in the coverage of 2024?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you to the Gitner family for having this event, for inviting me. Thanks to you for being my interrogator. And thanks to all of you for coming. And I see you sat me next to some native vegetation. Who knew that mandarin oranges grew here in Syracuse? In terms of the election, yeah, I mean, I think that some lessons have been learned. It doesn't mean that people haven't made mistakes. I think some serious mistakes have been made. I would say a couple of examples of that were the interviews with Donald Trump early on by CNN and NBC with Meet the Press. And the reason that those were mistakes is because they asked for those interviews for reasons that had nothing to do with journalism, that only had to do with marketing. So with CNN, it asked for the interview mainly because it was trying to demonstrate that it was open to Republicans. And so they invited Donald Trump. And this was well before a single primary, and they essentially declared him to be the front runner for the nomination before a single primary had been held. And there was the same problem with NBC. They had a new host for Meet the Press, and they wanted to promote their new host for Meet the Press. So, of course, naturally, what do? You invite Donald Trump to come on, and what does he do? As he normally did, he steamrolled the interviewers. And so I think those were two big mistakes. I do think that the press I hate to generalize across the press and the media, because we're a lot of different institutions. I mean, people tend to talk about the media as if we were all one, and we're not. So it would be as if people were talking about all lawyers, all doctors, all plumbers, whatever. You can't do that, but somehow people think it's okay to do that with regard to the media. Each of us makes our own judgments, and we come to our own conclusions and take our own actions. So, but I do think that people have focused very heavily on what Donald Trump would do if he were to get back into the White House. They have dived pretty deeply into what his policies are likely to be. You know, you talk about something like Project 2025. The New York Times, the Washington Post, a bunch of others were writing extensively about Project 2025. well before even the Democratic Party was talking about Project 2025. Finally, the Democratic Party discovered that as an issue, and they decided to push on it. And after that, people were criticizing the press, saying, why aren't you writing about Project 2025? And they had, and they should continue doing so, and continue writing about the kinds of policies that would be implemented. And also they should be focusing on very much on the people who surround Donald Trump, who are likely to be part of the administration. What is their background? What is their philosophy? And I think also very importantly is how would they implement these policies that they're proposing? Because many of them would require, it's a question as to how would they get around the existing laws, or how would they exploit the existing laws. And I think that we owe the public an explanation of all of that. I think that's been done reasonably well. I don't think there's any great mystery at this point about who Donald Trump is, what his policies are. He speaks actually quite openly about that. That's what's so extraordinary about it. And so I think people have done that. Most recently, people have talked, I think legitimately have said that we've made, that the press, I keep saying we, and I'm retired, so I disclaim any responsibility for anything that's happening today. But I've said the press has so-called sane-washed him. This is a new...
That was my next question.
Yeah, well, we're getting ahead here. So...
well, just to clarify for the audience, so sane washing is the act of packaging radical and outrageous statements in a way that makes them seem normal. So the criticism from Trump's critics are saying that the press is just kind of letting Trump say what he wants to say and presenting it as this is a quote that somebody running for president said.
Yeah, well, it is a quote that somebody running for president said, so that's fact. But the question is making essentially incoherent statements and making them coherent. And so I think that has been a problem. I think that when he is incoherent, which is with some regularity, that we should explain that he was completely incoherent in that and show people exactly what he said. And I think that the press generally has started to do more of that, particularly after his comments before, I think this was the Chamber of Commerce, or a chamber group, talking about what he would do with regard to the cost of childcare, and his response made no sense whatsoever. So I think a lot of the media had struggled with that, but I think now people are coming around to just sort of saying that what he's saying makes no sense.
And so you had a lot of, probably possibly more than any other editor except anyone at the Times, up close and personal interactions with Trump as president when you were running the Post. And so what do you think another Trump administration looks like for the media?
Bad, really bad for the media. I think he was bad during the first term. I think he's going to be a lot worse. Some of you may have seen H.E. Sulzberger's op-ed that he wrote for the Washington Post, looking ahead to what a Trump administration might do. I think if it's possible, I think he may have understated the case. So I think Trump will use every measure he can to try to suppress, punish, intimidate the media. He's talked openly about, of course, about prosecuting the media for disclosing national security secrets, classified information. I'm sure he will do that. I'm sure whoever he appoints to be Attorney General will make that an absolute priority. I think that he will probably classify more documents so that he can claim that these are national security documents. That would be quite a turn of events, given that he himself was showing national security documents to people who showed up at Mar-a-Lago. I think that he will, I wouldn't be surprised to see a rollback of the Freedom of Information Act, which is weak already, but which I would imagine he would go even further. He's talked openly about wanting to see journalists in jail. He said at his rallies that he's talked about journalists going to prison so that they can, as he put it, meet their bride, meaning that they would be subjected to sexual assault. I think that he will encourage his allies to bring more libel and defamation suits against media outlets. Those can be extraordinarily expensive to defend, and I think that will be a form of harassment. And some of his friends are quite wealthy, and so they can they can extend these lawsuits seemingly forever. So I think in almost every way he will. I do believe he's talked openly about that Comcast, which is the owner of NBC and MSNBC, that they should face treason charges solely for publishing or broadcasting stories that he deems to be unfavorable to him. And I would expect that we would see something like that. So I don't think there's anything that he won't do to punish the press. I also think that we may see some of his, as it happens in authoritarian governments elsewhere, you might see some of his allies purchasing media outlets that are weakened by the current financial condition and then use them to advance his own interests. We already see what Elon Musk has done with Twitter. He uses his 190 million, everything is sent to, well, not just to his 190 million followers, but to everybody's on Twitter. I'm not one of his followers, but I get all of his commentary. And that he will, we've already seen how he's using that. And I think that you'll see other allies of Trump purchase more media outlets and use them to benefit him.
You talked a lot in the book about how a major role of the press is vetting, a really basic and fundamental role is vetting candidates who are running for office. So Kamala Harris is a late entry into the campaign. So if you were editing now, how would you go about vetting her in a way that you felt was accurate, fair, and told voters what they needed to know?
Well, I would think that we should do, and some of this has been done, is a pretty deep dive on different chapters of her life and her career, mostly her career, and explore what her policies were, what her posture was toward different things, how she was as a manager, how she led, how she interacted with others, what her priorities were. I think we need to know that. I mean, I do think there's an element out there, including some within the press, who say, well, look, I mean, this is not a choice. You've got a guy who's anti-democratic against someone who does believe in democracy, and so none of the other stuff really matters. But I do think we need to know who we're electing as president of the United States, if in fact she gets elected, but who we're voting for president of the United States. And I think that we in the press have an absolute duty to look at who she is and what she stands for and how she could govern. And so what she did during the Biden administration and how she did it. What she did is, Attorney General for the state of California, all of that, district attorney in San Francisco. So I think that is totally fair game. In fact, I think it's an obligation for us to look at who candidates are, what they stand for, and if we don't do that, we've abdicated our responsibilities.
You were a pretty clear traditionalist, I think, in terms of how the press should operate and what our duties are and how journalists should go about covering things, and that is consistent throughout your career. It's been consistent in your public life since you left. It is a big theme of your book. There is a lot of media that has a very strong point of view, some that is more advocacy oriented, and those outlets are getting a lot of audience. So do you think that audiences are essentially buying what you're selling anymore?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. It's true. I mean, there are a lot of partisan outlets out there. There are a lot of outlets that are engaging in what we've always had since the beginning of this country, since the founding of this country, advocacy journalism. I mean, the early journalism in this country was advocacy journalism. For anybody who's read a terrific biography of Samuel Adams by Stacy Schiff, he was just like a propagandist. I mean, he wanted there to be a revolution. He wanted the British out, and he was disseminating a lot of fake news. Actually, a lot of stuff that he wrote was just not true. But all for a good cause. And that's the view of a lot of outlets today. Is all for a good cause. So, and people are drawn to that. Look, people are drawn to media outlets that affirm their pre-existing point of view. They feel comfortable with that. They want to be validated. That's just as true of people on the left as it is true of people on the right. There's no question about it. Do I think that people are looking for independent journalism? I think so. As I go around, I've been going around the country talking about this a lot since my book came out, and I find that people welcome that message. Whether they act on it or not, I don't know. But look, the New York Times I think, is an independent news organization. One can agree or disagree on how they approached this story or that story or whatever. But they have an enormous number of subscribers at this point. They are doing well. The Washington Post, for all its travails of today, it still has a very large audience for a text-oriented news, fundamentally text-oriented news organization, you have multiple networks that are pretty mainstream, and while Fox is bigger than any one of them, collectively they're bigger than Fox. So I think the evidence is that people do want independent journalism. Not everybody is an absolute partisan, and they may get upset over the stories, they may cancel here and there, but I think that they do want that. I mean, that just may be sort of an act, sort of my own faith in that kind of journalism, but I think there's substantial evidence that people do want independent, rigorously reported, highly verified journalism, and they feel betrayed when they discover that people aren't telling them the truth.
Since you left the Post in 2021, a lot has changed. A little bit you just alluded to. A paper that was profitable when the year that you left was in the red by 2022. Your replacement, Sally Busby from the AP, quit after 18 months and has been replaced by Matt Murray of the Journal. The Bezos-appointed publisher Fred Ryan is gone. He was replaced by CEO Will Lewis just this year, I think, who was recently accused of trying to kill negative stories surrounding his journalism career in the UK. So what's going on at the Post?
Well, I used the word interrogator to apply to you, and it appears to me that's pretty accurate term. So, look, I mean, what's happening at the Post is that they have experienced some real financial difficulties, I think, for a reason, and that is that the Post didn't prepare adequately for a post-Trump era. You look at what the New York Times did, they had a clear strategy to diversify, and not just diversify with more news, but to diversify out of news, okay? I mean, not that they were diminishing their commitment to news, but they started to do other things. So what did they do? They invested tens of millions of dollars in a cooking app that's been very successful. Initially it wasn't, and they actually, as I understand it from a very reliable person, they considered shutting it down at one point, but they stayed with it. And so then they had the games initiative. They built upon the digital crossword puzzle. They saw that their readership was really interested in these word games. That's what they like. And they built an entire business out of it, and that is the fastest growing area of the New York Times. They acquired Wirecutter. And that is now the leading product recommendation service. It's overtaken Consumer Reports, which was really stuck in an old era in terms of its approach. And that gives them the opportunity to earn money in a variety of ways, through traffic, through transaction fees, and through advertising surrounding all of that. So that's pretty good, because normally you just get advertising and things like that, but this gives them multiple opportunities to earn money. And so, and then they've acquired The Athletic, and they're trying to make that profitable. We'll see how it goes. I suspect they will. That has been a good strategy. We did not do that at the Post. I advised that we diversify. Back in 2018, it was clear that the Republicans had lost the House, and it looked like Trump might not win again. And so much of our traffic was built on investigations and on politics, and as might have been expected, once Biden won, he just wasn't as interesting, number one, and number two, people sort of felt, well, the threat of Trump is over. We don't really. They were supporting the Post because they felt that we were doing a good job of holding Trump accountable, and it's like, well, it's not a problem anymore. So I think that was a fundamental problem, and they also expanded too fast. They added more than 100 people after I left. That's a big expense, and they didn't earn the money that justified that kind of expense. So they're having to deal with that. Bezos, as rich as he is, like most wealthy people, they don't like to lose money, and that's not how they got rich in the first place. So. And anyway, his view of the Post is that it should be a sustainable enterprise. And I think that's a good philosophy. And I used to tell people at the Post that we should be grateful for that, because if he treated us like a charity and he got tired of that charity, we'd be in really bad shape. We would not have been left with a sustainable business, and that would be a disaster. So we should use the opportunity of his investments to create a sustainable business enterprise. And so I think he's trying to get it back on track, and he's hired somebody to be the publisher who he thinks can do that based on his experience at the Wall Street Journal. He has a strategy that he's announced. It's not for me to say whether that's going to be a successful strategy or not. He needs to articulate that strategy to his staff. He needs to win over the staff and persuade them that this will produce rewards in terms of additional revenue and additional readers and all of that. And obviously, we'll wait and see whether that actually occurs.
So the newspaper landscape in this country now is some kind of big metro that are regional papers. You have the Times and the Post, and I guess the Journal maybe competing as to be like the national paper. Is there room for 3 national papers?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, the Journal is a national paper. I mean, it's a little different. I mean, it has a heavy focus on business, of course, and its readership is heavily business-oriented, and a lot of its subscriptions are paid via expense accounts. So it's a little different from the business of the New York Times and the Washington Post that way, but it's still a national news organization, and they do a lot of good work. So I think there is room. I think the public does want a choice. I think there is an opportunity for the Post to be, in personality, a bit different from the New York Times. And I always wanted it to be more plain-spoken. I wanted it to be more populist in the best sense of the word, that it sort of, that it didn't communicate a sense of arrogance or superiority, that it spoke in the language that, roughly in the language that people used, that we were attuned to their particular interests, and that we didn't come across as elite. And so I do think that there's an opportunity for that, and nobody's going to be satisfied with any one of those publications, but so I think there, and the evidence was, look, we did have 6 straight years of profitability at the Washington Post. People were writing off the Washington Post when I got there. It was cutting staff. It had 580 people. We cut 35 in the first year. We were probably going to cut another 50 or more, and then Bezos acquired us. And we did turn it around, and the staff grew to about almost 1,000 people by the time I left. And news organizations go up and down. I think there's a tendency on the part of media pundits to to just project from the way things are today. The equation is always, if it's bad, it's just going to get worse. That's the way media pundits look at it. I mean, remember that the New York Times, people were talking about the New York Times going bankrupt right about 2009. Believe it or not, people have forgotten this. They were, their stock fell from $50 to $3.50. They needed to get a loan from Carlos Slim, a billionaire in Mexico, to rescue them. People were saying that BuzzFeed News and Huffington Post was going to take over, and they had written themselves, and themselves had written an innovation report that suggested they were way behind their competitors, and it was kind of a call to arms on their part. And they did turn themselves around, and to their credit. And the Washington Post was being written off. David Carr, the late David Carr, wrote a column about basically writing off the Washington Post. And then we turned it around, and he wrote another column saying some nice things about us, so I was happy about that. But so I think it's possible to turn it around, and I don't think, when media pundits look at this, it's just like straight line projection. It's bad, it's getting worse. It's good, they're going to be the victors. That's not how the world works. You can't turn around news organizations, and I think the Washington Post can't turn itself around.
The business model problem continues to be a problem, though. So you wrote in your book that you had yet to see a media ownership model that checked all the boxes that would keep all critics satisfied. Controlled by a wealthy individual was seen as serving the owner's financial interests. Ownership by a shareholder-owned company was pilloried for seeking short-term profits over long-term investment. Nonprofits relied heavily on money from benefactors with their own agendas, and big foundations controlled by trustees from the so-called elite. Media outlets that receive taxpayer money, public radio and TV, regularly face the threat of having their funding cut off by disgruntled politicians, and only episodically were they a source of groundbreaking investigative journalists. So that ticks off almost every current form
I don't know of any others.
of
Yeah,
ownership
that's it.
model.
Right. If I'd known of
there's
another one, I would have mentioned it.
there's the worker-owned collective model, but that's
That's a nonprofit too.
those are pretty small, or there's not that many of them. And you've worked at under a lot of those different ownership models. So from where you sat as an editor, what was the best environment to be working in? Like what kind of model was the best to get you to be able to do the best journalism?
Well, I think they're all. You can do great journalism in all those models. When I was at the Miami Herald, it was owned by Knight Ridder. It was doing well in those years, relatively well. It was certainly making good profits. The investigative reporting that was coming out of the Miami Herald, not my own, but by others, was really amazing. And the narrative writing that was coming out of the Miami Herald then, and many of the other Knight Ridder news organizations was tremendous as well. I worked under I was at the New York Times as well. I mean, they were going through their difficulties at the time, but they were doing tremendous work. I mean, frankly, the one that I felt most comfortable with, believe it or not, was where we had one owner, one wealthy owner, Jeff Bezos, who gave us our independence and let us do our job and had some good ideas about how we might transform our business and was willing to invest very much for the long term. And is that, he talked about, early on when he got there, he'd be talking about what we want to be in 20 years. I had never heard in my entire career a publisher or an owner talk about what we want to be in 20 years. It was always like next year, the next 2 years, maybe next quarter. That's it. The idea that we could think long term, that we could invest long term, I thought was great. The speed of decision making was incredible. It didn't have to go to a board, you didn't have a lot of sort of corporate bureaucrats around. He needed to review things. Our budget got approved like within a matter of weeks, if that, maybe 2 weeks. And that was fantastic. And then we could update it during the year. If we needed more, we could go back and ask for more. And all it required was one person to sign off, one person. And if we could justify it, there was a good chance we were going to get it. And so that speed of movement, the investment for the long term, the strategic thinking that turned us around, which said that we didn't have to be a local regional newspaper, that we could be a national publication, which was fundamental to our success. It was the single most important decision that was made, is that we change our strategy. That was his idea, to do that, because he said, well, you're based in the nation's capital. You're based in the nation's capital. You have the name The Washington Post, which can be leveraged to a national and global audience. And you have this history and heritage going back to Watergate of shining a light in dark corners, holding power to account, so that there are millions of people around the country and around the world who have never read a word of the Washington Post, but they know about the Washington Post and they have a good opinion of it. And then he said, well, the internet has given you a gift. And we were like, what's that? It destroyed all the pillars. He said, well, I know it's destroyed all the pillars of the business, but it means that you can deliver the paper, deliver the news, without having to deliver a physical product. And that means the cost of acquiring an additional subscriber or an additional reader is effectively zero. And so we need to figure out how to do that. And so that's what we went about doing, is proposing initiatives, which was an interesting process in itself. And look, he was presented when we first met with him extensively. It was in his boathouse at his house in Medina, Washington. It's a good-sized boathouse. And so, our president gave him a memo on. We thought it was kind of like appropriate for a boathouse, because it was like, this is a memo. You just bought a sinking ship. It's right here. And so, and the projections were terrible. And he read the memo, and he then silently, and we sat there, and he got up, and he started to walk away, and the president said, "Are you leaving?" And he just kept going, and he got some water, came back, and he said, "You're right. We have to figure out how to." He said, "I'm not intimidated. I'm not discouraged that easily. You're right. We have to grow. So let's sit down and figure out how we could grow." And that was amazing. And then he gave us the independence to do our job. And even though he came under enormous pressure from Donald Trump, who wanted to raise prices on the delivery of what the U.S. Postal Service was charging for the delivery of packages, the so-called last mile of delivery. And then, Trump interfered in the cloud computing contract for the Defense Department. It was a $10 billion contract, and he made sure that it didn't go to Amazon. And people were joking. The cost of the Post was not $250 million that Bezos paid for it, but it was $10 billion, $250 million. And so that was the big joke. I don't know how much he appreciated that joke, but that was the joke.
But there's been a lot of change since then, and according to a recent article in The Atlantic, you were one of 6 former Post employees who wrote to Bezos and said you have a problem at the paper. So has your opinion or impression of him and his ownership, has it changed?
Well, you read that piece closely, because I was only mentioned just like in a millisecond in that piece. So I think he needs to be more engaged with the Post. I think he needs to spend more time. I said this in the actual epilogue of my book, so I'm not telling you anything I haven't said before. I think he needs to spend more time getting to know the people in the newsroom and getting to know the people in the rest of the organization. He needs to understand the culture better. He needs to communicate more regularly. He doesn't communicate regularly at all. And I think his basic view is that I hired a CEO, and the CEO does that job. But I think he owes it to the Post. He's talked about how important the Post is as an institution. I think he believes that. But I think he should demonstrate that by communicating more regularly with the people in that organization, and in particular the newsroom, which actually would like to hear from him more. So, and I think that the disengagement has not been beneficial to the Post. And when he retired, he didn't fully retire, but when he stepped down as the CEO of Amazon, shortly after I retired, I don't know whether he was falling in my path, but probably not. But he stepped down as the CEO. He became executive chairman of the board, I think is the title he has now. He said at the time, "I'm going to spend more time on his space company, Blue Origin. I'm going to spend more time on his philanthropic efforts, which largely focus on climate change, and he's going to spend more time on the Post." And there were a lot of media pundits at the time who said, "Oh, that's terrible. He's going to spend more time on the Post. That's such a bad thing. He shouldn't be interfering." And I was thinking to myself, I hope he spends more time on the Post. And the reality is that he did not spend any more time on the Post. He did spend more time on Blue Origin, and he did spend more time on his philanthropic efforts, particularly climate. And I wish he'd spent more time on the Post and paying more attention to our competitive threats and how we should respond to those.
Google recently worked out a deal with the state of California to jointly fund local newsrooms of about $250 million over 5 years. And in exchange, this deal effectively killed a proposed California Journalism Protection Act, which would have forced tech platforms to pay for the journalism content that they carry. Newsrooms, especially local ones, need money. Do you think there's any consequences to this kind of approach, this kind of like corporate public funding partnership?
Well, it's complex. I don't know all the particulars of the California legislation. I should study it more closely, I guess. But there's an outfit that I'm on the board of. They came out with their own report. It's called the Center for News, Technology, and Innovation. Just today, they released their report looking at all the media finance legislation globally. So what happened in Canada, what's happened in California, what's happened in Australia, what's happened in Europe and elsewhere. And it's complex. There are opportunities for financing, and then there are real complexities with these things. I mean, in Canada, for example, Canada was trying to mandate how much money the platforms would give to news organizations. It's complex. Like, what's a news organization? Who's a journalist? Who should get the money? All that sort of stuff is just very, very complex. And then, look, Facebook decided, no, we don't want any part of that. And they pulled out, and they stopped carrying news. And that's been really hurt. That's really hurt Canadian news organizations because they don't get any traffic from Facebook anymore. And Google considered doing that, but ultimately they reached an agreement to provide $100 million to news organizations. They basically said, we're turning it over to an independent entity. It was decided where they're going to do it because Google said, we don't want to decide where the money's going to go. Who's a journalist? Who should get it? Who's not a journalist? All that sort of stuff. Those are tricky questions, right? So I think it's pretty complex. And the question is like, well, what do you charge for? Do you charge for the link? You charge somebody clicks through the link? You charge what exactly are you charging for? What should you charge for? And these are far more complex than I think people realize. It's clear that Google is willing to pay a certain amount, and that's good, and that can be helpful. But it's not going to solve our business model problem. The business model problem is something we're going to have to figure out. And there are other things. There's tax benefits for news organizations for the journalists that they hire, tax credits and things like that could be helpful. I want to be careful that the news outlets are not dependent on the government for their survival, because what the government can give, the government can take away. And I have no doubt that if Trump were in the White House and the federal government were giving money to news organizations in some way, that he would hold that over them, that he would intimidate them, he would threaten them with withholding that based on his assessment of whether they were fair, whether they were so-called fake news. All you have to do is look at what some Republicans have said about NPR. All you have to do is look at what Trump did with the Voice of America, where he ousted the management of Voice of America and put in one of his partisan cronies, and who started firing people on the staff and wanted to turn Voice of America into sort of a propaganda outlet for the Trump administration. So it's complex, and I don't pretend to have the answer to it. I do think that people should evaluate the opportunities and the complexities. That's the reason the outfit that I'm on the board of has put out a report. I wasn't involved in the research staff does it independently. And people should debate it and try to figure out what kind of legislation might be helpful with a full knowledge of the complexities.
So even though you only left the newsroom a couple years ago, a lot has changed technologically just in those 2 years. So you were leading a newsroom that was probably largely untouched by artificial intelligence. And so when you think about those challenges now, from a newsroom leadership perspective, what are the things that you'd want to be thinking about in terms of how your organization used AI, provided content for AI language models? Like, what are the top of mind things from an EIC's perspective on that?
Well, I think generative AI presents a lot of opportunities for news organizations. We should seize on them. And I'm encouraged to see a lot of news organizations are already doing that. They're not resisting in the way that they've resisted other technological advances. I think in the past, with a lot of that's happened in the digital world, it's been, we've been slow, stubborn, and clumsy. And I think there's some indications now that we won't be slow or as stubborn. We might be clumsy, but we'll see how that goes. So, look, there are really opportunities for time management. Gen AI can do a lot of tasks that, reporters and other journalists in the newsroom have so many more tasks right now in terms of writing alerts, updating stories constantly, writing headlines that are friendly for SEO or friendly for social, that selecting photos, apologies to the photo editors here, selecting photos for their stories online. I'm into the horror of photo editors, I know, but it's the way it is, and so Gen AI can be really helpful with that. it can also be used in a powerful way for reporting exercise, data analysis really fast. Somebody was telling me about an effort to use Gen AI to evaluate, for example, places that have been bombed severely and assess like what kind of bomb, what kind of weapons were used based on what can be observed from satellite imagery. So I think it can be used very powerfully. That said, there's a huge risk for the press, but also for society as a whole from Gen AI. So we're already seeing some of it. We're going to see a lot worse. There's going to be lots of fabricated images, still images, fabricated videos, fabricated audios, disseminated instantly to large audience, millions upon millions of people, who a substantial portion of whom are actually going to believe those images are true, and they're going to act on it. Sometimes they could act violently based on that. That's happened in other countries like India, where some of these things get spread over WhatsApp and Telegram and what have you. And then the other risk is that, look, there'll be verified images. There'll be verified still images, verified audio, verified video. And then people who feel that, well, that's for some, if that hurts them, if that hurts their reputation, they'll simply say that it was fabricated. And so the risk is that the public will be unable to discern what's true, what's false, what's fact, what's fiction, and may conclude that you can never really determine what the truth is, and there's no point in trying. And so then you just sort of, communicate. You just align with whoever is your tribal leader ideologically, and that's a really risky place to be for not knowing what the truth is, feeling that the truth can never be determined. That's risky for the media, but it's even more risky. It's really risky for society as a whole if we hope to make any kind of progress.
And my last question, and I'll open it up to questions, so students be thinking. So you wrote that the top editor's responsibility is the strength and integrity of the news report. And you just talked about thinking about how generative AI is going to be used in the newsroom. You have podcasts in newsrooms, video in newsrooms, other kind of business products or digital products and all these things. So is it still the primary responsibility of the EIC? Is it still the strength and integrity of the news report when there's so many other things happening around you that you're also responsible for?
Oh, totally. In fact, I would say that's the most important responsibility you have. Look, I mean, in this world that's changing so fast, I think there are some things that we should hold on to. And what we should hold on to are the traditional values. Make sure that, that we're in the process of verification. We don't just put stuff out there because people want to read it. We put stuff out there that we are confident is true, that we've done the work to try to determine that it's true, that we try to approach our work with an open mind. We do it honestly, honorably, fairly, rigorously, with determination, with the goal of getting at the facts and getting at the truth and trying to put it all in proper context. And that's what we ought to hold on to, no matter what form, no matter what else happens in our business, no matter how many new products we have. The reality is that the forms of storytelling are going to change, already have changed dramatically. We have all these new forms, podcasts and short videos and newsletters and you name it, everything. And so that'll change, and we should do that, and we need to pay attention to how storytelling is going to change and how media consumption habits have changed, because if media consumption habits change, we have to change with them. We can't resist them. We can't force people to read the way that we'd like them to read. We can't be just nostalgic about the way things were and mourn like what's not working. We need to look ahead and figure that out. But as we do that, what should distinguish us from everybody else out there is that we have these core values, and that we're sticking to these core values, and we're going to apply them in all these different storytelling forms and with all of the products that we have.
All right, we're going to open it up to questions. I see a hand, white T-shirt, about halfway up. Yep. Hang on, we're going to get a mic to you. Right? Do we have mics? Nope.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Hi. Thank you for your time, first and foremost. I wanted to ask, what's an integral piece of advice that you would give to aspiring photojournalists or journalists that goes slightly beyond surface level, or actually further beyond surface level, something that most, someone in your position, you don't hear them give students often,
Just for photojournalists?
or journalists alike, or both.
But photojournalists are special. So that's why we separate them from all other journalists,
Speak carefully. I am one.
Yes, I know. My life's at risk here. Gosh, I don't know. Special sort of advice. Look, I was talking, as far as, journalists generally, I like to talk about, people would come to the Post and they would ask me, what do you need to do to succeed here? And what kind of people are you looking for? And I always said, I like people who are more impressed with what they don't know than with what they know or think they know. I want people who are curious, who are open-minded, who are thinking really hard about the questions that need to be asked, not so much thinking that they have the answers before they start in the reporting. Because I don't understand, if they already know the answers, I don't know what reporting means. I really don't. It's just an exercise in confirmation bias or something like that. I'm going to talk to the people I know are going to tell me what I want to hear. I'm going to only look at the evidence that reinforces what I think is true, and I'm going to ignore everything else. And so I want people who are, curiosity. And that's true of photojournalists too, and that they're looking at things from with an open mind, with a special angle, willing to explore, approach things with a level of humility that, we talk in this field a lot about swagger, and people have said, I brought the swagger back to the Washington Post, whatever. But I'm such a swagger guy. What I really value is this sense of, we're learning. One of the great things about journalism is that you get to learn. They pay you for it. Fantastic. Right here, all of you are paying to learn. But later, when you graduate, they'll pay you to learn. And so it's great. And you get to be a lifelong learner. And the people who don't see that's the great joy of journalism and that's the great opportunity of journalism, I think are really missing out on what journalism is all about, is that we're constantly learning. And we should think about that let's open our minds and let's do our jobs and let's go about it rigorously and, search for the facts and tell the world what we found and be confident when we do that, then we know what the hell we're talking about.
Thank you.
Another question. Down in the front, also white shirt, right behind Professor Gitner.
Biased toward white shirts.
Yeah, sorry, it's the easiest to pick out in the crowd. Yeah.
Please pass that down, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Baron. My question is, what would you like to see happen over the course of the election to keep the media transparent with its consumers?
To keep the media transparent, what?
With its consumers.
With consumers, did
Yeah.
you say? I be transparent. I think that we're in a time where we need to not just tell people what's happening, we need to show them. We need to provide the evidence as much as we can. In a way, we need to be like lawyers in a courtroom, not the advocacy role of lawyers, but the idea that, think of the public as almost a jury, and that we need to present the evidence, and they need to see it. So if there's a document that we're referring to, provide the document. We have the tools to do that. We can annotate it. We can show people the whole document to see. They can read it for themselves and see if we're taking it out of context or not. Same with the video. Same with an audio file. Provide the whole thing. Provide the excerpt. People can go look at it. If we are using data, show people where it came from. Kind of like sort of contemporary version of footnoting. And allow people to, and with the message being to the public, check our work. Feel free. And by the way, here's all the work we did. So they know how much work went into it. And I think it's really important that we do that. And I think the public wants more of that. You know, Wikipedia, as much as it gets criticized, there's actually high level of trust in Wikipedia. And one of the reasons I believe is because it is so highly footnoted and they cite all of their sources. And we could learn something from that and probably should learn something from that.
I have to find somebody who's not wearing a white shirt. Red shirt. Does your shirt say Radnor on it?
Yeah.
I went to high school there.
You went to Radnor High School?
I did. Class of 96?
I went to Radnor High School.
Probably not class of 96.
Well,
We'll talk
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Baron, for your time. My question is on the topic of AI. Sports Illustrated last year was exposed for using entirely AI-generated writers and images and articles. How do we balance the economic benefits? You talked a lot about the benefits of generative AI for journalism with maintaining the integrity of, you want people behind your stories and you want to keep journalists in jobs.
Sure. Well, look where Sports Illustrated is today. You know, it's out of business. So people didn't want that. They rejected that. They were appalled by that. And I think that's how the public would react. And so I think what the public wants is they do want real human beings. And by the way, Gen AI can't report. It can't go out there and talk to people on the street. It can't go and find things that are not readily available. What it does is it basically canvasses the internet, and some of what it gets, it's true. It also can't distinguish between what's true and what's false, okay? So it can sort of maybe decide, well, this outlet is more reliable than this one or whatever, but it can't actually do any, it cannot engage in the process of verification. So I don't think reporters are going away. You're glad to hear that. So I don't think reporters are going away. It just means that reporters need to do their jobs and do it really well, be great storytellers, be great researchers. And because Gen AI cannot do all that work. It can do write some stories. I mean, it's not impossible for it to do that. That is going to be more of the commodity variety, not the kind of stories that are going to distinguish a news organization. So I think you're okay there.
Sorry, I'm trying to mix it up. I'm like looking for a grad student or something. Grad students, are they all in the back? How about person in the back with their hand up who's wearing a black shirt on the aisle? Oh, I'm wearing a brown shirt. Oh, I'm sorry. Verification, truth matters.
Hi, my name is Yasmin. I'm a television, radio, and film graduate student. Thank you for your time. I was wondering if you could speak a little to the rising role of the independent journalists in this new space. You talked a little bit about how the news is not reliant on the government to get its funding, but there have been these stakeholders, these keepers at the door who have run the news industry for generations, and people have kind of noticed that, especially like Gen Z and Generation Alpha. And they're less likely to maybe trust a traditional news source rather than an individual. So how can independent journalists take advantage of the current time of media we are in and kind of gain that sense of credibility and trust and ensure we get ahead of this like always sense of impending fascism, which you kind of talked about with former President Trump.
It's not a word I used, but okay.
But that's all.
Well, great. Go do it. You know, I mean, that's my view. There's a great opportunity to be entrepreneurial. Great time to be entrepreneurial. There are people starting up new sites. People who are more digitally oriented, more sensitive to how consumers like to get their information. They can communicate greater authenticity because of who they are. They don't seem like a nameless, faceless institution. If you can make a business out of it, go for it. Maybe raise some money. See how you can do with that with friends and family. Keep your costs low. A lot of the costs of actually setting up a news site now have dropped dramatically. A lot of what, I'm on the board of the Knight Foundation, which does like the bulk of the funding for news industry and the profession, and more than any other philanthropic organization. They and now MacArthur Foundation and in this initiative called Press Forward, providing a lot of money for basic infrastructure so that people who want to start up sites can do so. They need to make sure that they're not just a bunch of well-meaning journalists, although I like well-meaning journalists, but they need to have good business sense, they need to have technology expertise, they need to know how to market themselves, they may need to know how to fundraise, whether it's fundraise in the private sector or fundraise from the public. And so they need to create the elements of a successful enterprise. And so if you can do that, and you've got a really good idea, and you've got a fresh approach, and you're better than what's out there, then there's a chance that you can succeed. Because the costs of actually starting up and operating are not going to be as high, are not anywhere near as high as they were before. And so that's about as welcoming an environment for entrepreneurial efforts as I think I've ever seen in my lifetime.
I think that's an excellent optimistic note to end on, because we're about at the end of our time. So I want to thank Marty Baron for coming to see us today. And I also want to thank the Gitner family for making this possible. This is a really exciting event, and I'm so happy that everyone turned out to ask great questions about journalism. Have a great night.